Welcome back to RealClear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're pleased to welcome former Utah State Senator Dan Liljenquist, board member of the Retirement Security Initiative and president and founder of Liljenquist Strategies. Dan, welcome to the show.
Bill, great to be with you. Thank you.
Dan, I asked you on to discuss a subject that got almost no attention during the presidential campaign, and that's entitlement reform, in particular runaway government pensions. This has been a signature issue of yours since winning numerous budget awards as a Utah state legislator. We've been hearing alarms about unfunded pension liabilities for a long time, and yet governments can still borrow all the money they want at very attractive interest rates. Why can't this go on forever?
You know, Bill, there's a principle in government and really in life that reality is not negotiable. And I think what state and local governments have done is they've used a low interest rate environment to really ramp up their borrowing, and they're borrowing really against a future day of reckoning. They do that in a variety of ways, not only by issuing bonds at low interest rates for infrastructure needs, but also by chronically underfunding their pensions. And they chronically underfund their pensions by assuming that the stock market will provide really what I think are unrealistic returns over the coming years. If you can put less money away today because you assume that the market's going to do well tomorrow, you know, that's really easy for politicians to make that choice, and that's what you see. But eventually, market returns catch up with you, and I think that's what people are realizing with the pension crisis around the country, is that their rosy projections didn't show up, and now they're realizing that they have to pay the piper. Just look at Puerto Rico and their situation down there. It's an absolute disaster, and you're starting to realize that the borrowing that states and municipalities and territories can go bankrupt. There's been an assumption for a long time that sovereign governments, particularly states, can't go bankrupt. But when you can't meet your obligations and your taxpayers revolt, you can go structurally bankrupt or at least be insolvent and not be able to pay your bills. And I think that's what several states, and certainly Puerto Rico as a territory, have realized. And I think people are waking up to that. Hopefully they're waking up to that.
Dan, while you were in the state Senate, you helped Utah transition from a defined benefit pension system to a defined contribution system. Was there a lot of opposition to this?
Yeah, there was a lot of opposition. You know, we realized in 2008, Utah went into the 2008 market crash with the best funded and best run pension system in the country. I was a brand new legislator. When I got into the state Senate, I made probably the biggest mistake of my career, and that was I had no idea what I wanted to do. And I sat down with the Senate president, and he said, Dan, where do you want to serve? And, you know, I've been pretty good with money over the years, so I said, I have no idea. Just put me close to the money, wherever that is, and I'll do my best. Well, he gave me the worst assignments in the legislature. He gave me the Medicaid program. I was put on the Health and Human Services Sub-Appropriations Committee, and we'll get to that in a minute. But I also was made the chairman of the Retirement Committee, but the Senate president said at the time, don't worry, nothing ever happens over there. And I stepped into office, actually was sworn in a couple weeks early because of the market crash. And what we learned from the 2008 market crash, that even though Utah has always paid what was required of them for their pension contributions, or was required of us, 1 year's worth of pension losses in the stock market blew a 30% hole in our pension fund.
Wow.
What that meant is that we had to increase our contributions by hundreds of millions of dollars a year, not just for a couple of years, but for 25 years. And when it really hit home is we found out that 1 year's worth of market losses was going to cost the state of Utah the equivalent of 8,000 school teachers in our schools for 25 years.
So how did you fix it?
Well, look, the first thing you do when you find a problem this large, you got to treat it a little bit like a chemical spill. And the first thing you do when you come across a chemical spill in your backyard is you work to cap the spill. You don't keep pouring into it. And then you work overtime to clean it up. And we thought, okay, we've made promises to our current employees and retirees. And the number one goal of pension reform is to make sure that we can meet our commitments to them. Because, look, we made promises. They came to work for the state. If we have pension costs spiral out of control, it impacts them. And not only the raises we're able to give them over the career, but also the amount of of help that they have. For example, teachers in classrooms. And so we thought, look, we've got to do this for them. And that was our first and primary goal. But what we did was we said, look, going forward, if we can change the way retirement is funded for new workers, then we can over time reduce and eliminate the pension-related bankruptcy risk that we were facing as a state. And so that's what we did. We moved to a defined contribution style system that sets the amount that the employer contributes towards the retirement plans for all new workers. It was very generous, but it's a set amount. And that allows us over time, person by person, to reduce and eliminate our pension-related bankruptcy risk. It was fair to current workers because we kept their current deal the same, and it's fair to new workers in that they know exactly what they're getting. And again, it's a pretty generous contribution towards their retirement going forward.
Utah's a pretty small state with a fairly homogeneous population. Could states as large and diverse as California take a similar reform path, or will they have to wait until bankruptcy forces changes on them?
Speaking to the political environment, it was no easy lift even in Utah. We had thousands of people protesting at the Capitol and protesting me personally. And it was tough to explain what we were trying to do, but it can be done. Look, as I said before, reality is not negotiable. Eventually, pension costs will overwhelm state and local budgets, and it is in the interests of every union member and public employee to reform the pension systems, particularly going forward, so that the state and local governments can meet their commitments to their current employees and retirees. When that happens, and when people realize just how expensive these programs are, and really the impact that they have on current budgets, I think you'll see some changes. And we're already seeing that around the country. As pension costs continue to spiral and grow and really explode at an unprecedented rate, you're seeing more and more police and fire unions, for example, in Arizona, came aboard a reform that 5 years ago they never would have agreed to. A reform, actually, that not only has a new plan for new police and fire members, but also made some changes to current benefits so they could stabilize their plan. And I think you're seeing that around the country.
Dan, in 2012, the Government Accounting Standards Board issued new guidelines for public pension plans setting of discount rates, with two different tiers for plans considered fully funded and plans considered underfunded. What kind of impact has this had, if any, on the suspect accounting practices politicians use to push problems off into the future?
You know, I think it is a step in the right direction. I personally don't think there should be two different discount rates for plans that are fully funded and plans that are considered underfunded. And here's why. The way plans are funded is, again, they're funded in two ways. You put in current contributions from, existing budgets, and then you count on stock market returns, investment returns to provide the balance of the benefit you provide, you promise. And so what happens, though, that the higher your assumed rate of returns, and again, you can wipe out all the liabilities in the country if we just assume we're going to get 12% returns every year, and there's just, it's not realistic. I don't think it makes sense to have two different sets of rules, because really, if taxpayers are guaranteeing these pensions literally out of their pocket, then we should be assuming closer to risk-free rates of return for all pension plans. That requires an upfront, fully funding of the plan, and then a more conservative investment strategy over time. It's the predictability that's important, and that's what you get with a defined contribution plan. You get a plan that we know exactly how much that plan is going to cost today and tomorrow and next year and 10 years from now. Whereas with these pension plans, it's easy to make long-term promises and just assume that the world is going to be beautiful and rosy and wonderful, and, allows, again, politicians to kick the can down the road.
Dan, public sector unions are the only segment of the union movement enjoying growth, and they do love their defined benefit pensions. What kind of threat does this represent to the taxpayers?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest area. I think you're seeing defined benefit pensions disappear in the rest of the country, even among private sector unions, because the costs are so staggering that it really costs a lot of money to guarantee what will happen in the future. Public sector unions really are the last holdouts in this movement towards reform. And, I can understand why they're fighting. If you can have a guaranteed benefit that's guaranteed by the taxpayers, and you have a small group of very highly focused and highly motivated union workers to back you up, you can bring inordinate pressure on legislators to protect your interests. It's a very strong, powerful interests. But what I hope people will realize, and what I think rank-and-file union members are realizing around the country, is that the reform movement is actually helping guarantee their own pensions. What good is a pension if you can't get wage increases because pension costs are eating up every penny of the budget? And that's what people are realizing. There are real trade-offs. And so I think you're seeing, again, a slow realization come over rank-and-file union members that pension reform really is in their interests. That's not always the message they get from their leaders, but it's something that when it's communicated appropriately, we see significant buy-in from rank-and-file union members who end up supporting reform.
Dan, among all the entitlements threatening to bankrupt our states, Medicaid looms large. How has Obamacare exacerbated this problem?
Obamacare has really shaken up the entire healthcare market. And I think what it introduced primarily was uncertainty around where things were going to go, how much government control would even push further into Medicaid program, which the Medicaid program is already largely controlled by the federal government. What I think it did, though, is also for states that expanded into Medicaid, initially, they got 100% of their funding covered by the federal government.
First one's free.
That's right. As those subsidies start to then evaporate or at least move down to the 90-10 match that Obamacare promises, states are realizing that with a massively expanded Medicaid population, that they are struggling more than ever to keep up with their Medicaid cost burden. And so, when you add millions of people to the Medicaid rolls and then over time shift more and more costs to the states for that expansion, it gets really expensive for a Medicaid program that states were already struggling to fund appropriately. So it's a big issue.
What did Utah do to restructure its Medicaid program?
Back in 2010, 2009 and 2010, those legislative sessions, as I sat in the Medicaid funding meetings and ended up, because of the massive growth in Medicaid during the downturn, as we had more and more people going to the Medicaid program, we realized that we had to cut other parts of the Medicaid budget, including services for the disabled, the mentally ill, and substance abuse programs, to fund our traditional hospital and doctor fee-for-service side of Medicaid. And when we looked at it, we realized that if Medicaid continued to grow, it would grow from about 18% of our general fund spending in 2009 to over 30% of our general fund spending by 2020. And that it would be a direct dollar-for-dollar transfer from higher ed and other Medicaid programs to fund this runaway train that was Medicaid. So what we felt like we had two options, really, if we were going to keep the current program, and that would be to lower our rates so we paid to providers. And then the second thing was to question everything they did so as to try to control costs in a fee-for-service world. And we didn't think that was sustainable. So in 2011, I ran legislation that did really a couple of things. One, it capped the growth of Medicaid on a per-member per-month basis to the growth rate of our state budget. Previously, it had been growing about 3 times that rate. But most importantly, what we did then is we actually then took that money and we bundled that money on a per-member per-month basis to our healthcare providers in the state with a commitment that if they were able to keep people well and keep people out of the hospitals, that they could keep the difference. And it was really kind of a fundamental shift. We wanted to go from paying our providers for treating people, and oftentimes in the most expensive places, in the emergency rooms and other places, to paying them to keep them well. And that was a fundamental shift. And what it did for us, we actually worked very closely with our provider community in Utah, including our major hospital systems, and worked closely with them and said, look, if we capped the Medicaid growth rate, what would you need to make it work? And they came and said, if you promise not to rebase the contract, meaning if we are successful in lowering the costs, that you will not just scrape all that money off the table, we think we can do it. And so we actually passed unanimous legislation, became the first state in the country to cap Medicaid growth on a per-member per-month basis to the growth rate of the state budget. And we are now, it took us a couple of years to get the federal waivers to do it. And we are now 3 years into a program that seems to be running well. We've been able to bend the cost curve of Medicaid and really critically keep that Medicaid program stable as part of the overall state budget. So far, so good.
If every state capped its Medicaid program like Utah did, what would happen to states that have more than their fair share of poverty?
What we're doing is we're actually getting more mileage out of the dollars we're spending on Medicaid. And look, if you think about a healthcare provider, it takes you about $20 of revenue to generate $1 of margin on a Medicaid patient if you drive them to an emergency room, the most expensive place for care, right? But if you've prepaid a provider, $1 of cost reduction is $1 of margin. And so if you're able to go and get with your Medicaid patients and get them into a primary care office and get them care at a much cheaper environment, what we're saying is they get to keep the difference. And what we found is that our providers, by engaging with their patients, really engaging in their care, they are highly aligned to do that now in a way that they weren't before. And so as a result, we've been able to get a lot more mileage out of our Medicaid dollars, and really our providers have been able to invest really more significantly in a way that rewards them for doing so and keeping people well. And that's what we want. Because of that, we've been able to handle the Medicaid volume and begin to start repairing the funding cuts we made in the disabled and mental illness side of the ledger for Medicaid.
If you look at cost drivers, what obligations do Americans have for providing free health care to non-citizens?
We all live in a community, and personally, I think that should be up to each community to decide their values and how they want to approach that population. Obviously, there's a balancing of incentives bill that has to be weighed, and I think, again, that is best done locally. We're a country that says if somebody shows up in the emergency room and they're dying, we don't make them pay beforehand. And I think that's a moral choice that we choose to make. But at the same time, we've got to recognize that there's a balancing of incentives, that if people don't take personal responsibility for their own health, there's no way government can actually fill all of that gap. What I'm disturbed by is a trend to dictate rules from Washington, where I think in Utah, we would organize our care differently if we were fully autonomous in how we did that. And I think that even non-citizens in our community, they live here. And I think that in Utah, we would probably choose to come up with a program that would treat them on our own, but maybe perhaps without some of the mandates that the federal government lays on top of us.
Dan, the country just went through a major reset with a national repudiation of progressive policies. And despite that, entitlement reform was notably missing from the issues being debated on the campaign trail. Given the unprecedented control Republicans now have at both the federal and state level, do you see them tackling intractable entitlement programs, or do you expect business as usual?
I don't know, to be frank, Bill. I think this is the biggest issue. If people aren't tackling entitlement reform, they're not doing their job. The entitlements that we face, the unfunded liabilities, are so staggering that they impact and will impact every aspect of American life for decades to come. And, I've made my political career has been focused on entitlement reform, and I have been discouraged that not only has it not been part of the campaign, there's almost been a promise to say, don't worry, we're not going to do anything about it. I think Republicans, oftentimes on this issue, the only adults in the room, although we have our own issues in history of making bad decisions, really, I think history will judge the Republican Party on whether or not they are true to what they say their goal is, and that is long-term fiscal sustainability. I hope it's the case. I hope on things like pensions, for example, that the federal government does not try to intervene by bailing out states for their unfunded pension liabilities. But even more importantly, I think there has to be long-term Medicare reform, cost reform, and really I think moving towards a situation like Utah's put in place, working with providers instead of against providers, perhaps through the Medicare Advantage program is a good way to go. And I think Republicans, again, if they miss this opportunity, it's going to haunt them forever. I think this is, again, a perfect time to start addressing entitlement reform.
Given the fundamental nature of democracy, why would politicians ever stop buying votes today by making promises that have to be paid for by their successors tomorrow?
Well, that is the problem of democracy. It's hard to find people who will tell the truth and who will put their necks on the line for it. But again, for me, as I made those choices, I looked around and said, look, I'm going to live through the next 40 years of this country. I'm 42 years old. When I started in government, I was 34. And it was very, 2030, 2040 was very much in my time horizon. And I felt like if anything were going to happen, it would it'd have to be up to me and those like me who are actually going to live through the next 40 years to make the changes. And I hope that there's enough of those folks getting into government. And, it's been fun for me to go around the country and work with different state legislators on things like pension reform, because there are a lot of them out there. People who can do a little bit of math, both Republicans and Democrats, and realize that doing nothing is really committing to national suicide. And really delaying it, as it's said by my good friend Steve Moore, delaying these changes really is fiscal child abuse. And so, we should be looking for leaders who are willing to take on these issues. And really, those would be the leaders, I think, that can carry us forward into a new generation of prosperity.
Dan, speaking of fiscal child abuse, you've got 6 kids, so you're doing your share to create the taxpayers of tomorrow that'll have to support all us retiring baby boomers. Do you see young people forking over the lion's share of their income to the tax man, or should we expect a rebellion before it's all said and done?
Well, look, my wife and I say to everybody we meet that we've done our duty to Social Security by having 6 children, and we're raising them right. I try to teach my kids about the principle of taxation every time, principally around Halloween, where I tax 50% of their candy.
Do you?
And I do. And if that's any indication, there will be revolts around it when it comes to actually their paychecks. I think as those bills start to mount, I think there's going to be building resentment among the youth. And if you notice, we've been very hesitant to really tax all of society. We'd much rather pass the worst kind of taxes, which are borrowed funds that compound with interest over time by deficit spending. And one day, that burden will be so massive that I do think there will be a revolt unless something's done sooner rather than later to fix it.
Well, Dan, let's hope when that time comes, there'll be some elder statesmen like yourself that can get us back on the right track. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Bill, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
That was former Utah State Senator Dan Liljenquist, board member of the Retirement Security Initiative and president and founder of Liljenquist Strategies, here on RealClear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. You can check out RealClear Radio Hour on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at RealClearFrezza. And while you're at it, take a look at RealClearFuture.com for daily updates on the next big wave of technologies. We'd like to thank our sponsor, Old Boston Restorations, for their support. Old Boston is a boutique property management company located in Boston's South End. Visit them online at oldbostonrestorations.com. That wraps up our show for this week. Please join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.